Purple Robe here, and you are about to embark on a book I wrote called Midnight Surrogate. It is an intense thriller involving two characters set in a room. I don't want to give too much of it away. It deals with adult content, so trigger warnings and such. This is a serious story. It's a suspense thriller, as I said, but it's got some. It tackles some serious issues, but I think it's good. So I hope you like it. Give it a try. Give it a couple chapters. There's 5 on YouTube, just like all the rest of my books. If you want any more than that, you go to my Patreon page. Check it out. I hope you like it. I hope you can last to get to the end, because I think it's worth it. Enjoy.
Joanne Jones had been suffering from sleep paralysis for years. The occurrences had been so frequent in her life that she couldn't rightly recall the very first memory of it. Jo was pretty sure it began in early childhood. She would be in her bed, or wherever she was when she fell asleep. She would be in the exact position that she was actually in, usually on her back, which was unusual in itself since she normally slept on her side or stomach. And then she would wake up. Except she wouldn't. You see, when the body enters REM sleep, the brain produces a chemical that creates a paralysis or atonia that overtakes its muscles. This is why a person doesn't move around when he or she dreams. In Joanne's case, her mind awakens from sleep, but the brain doesn't stop pumping these chemicals, which could be gamma-aminobutyric acid, or glycine, scientists aren't 100% sure, through her muscles. Thus, her body remains atonic, while her brain awakens. All she can do is lay there and breathe. Lay there, breathe, and be horrified of her situation. It had happened so many times that nowadays when it occurs, her first thought is, not again. Then she would doggedly begin the process of waking her body up. There were 3 ways she would use, but only one ever really worked. The first attempt would be to move. Her arm or her leg. She would attempt to roll herself over, even if it meant rolling off the bed and onto the floor. She had no doubt that would jolt her body awake. And while she was always so hopeful in the moment, and oftentimes she could make parts of her body move an inch or two, it was never enough to be of any benefit. The second way she would try to awaken was to call for help. Of course, she couldn't move her mouth, which made it quite difficult. Sometimes, Joanne couldn't summon up even a peep. Other times, what would emanate from her lips would be a racked and raspy moan. In all the time she dealt with this problem, only once had someone woken her up. Her ex-boyfriend, Paul, said he'd heard her screaming in her sleep and had rushed in and shaken her into consciousness. She'd seen the whole thing, watched him enter their bedroom, calling for her to wake up, and then, getting no response beyond the continued moaning, had grabbed her by the shoulders and shaken. Later, Joanne asked if he'd noticed if her eyes were open or closed, and he said he couldn't really tell in the dark. He figured that they were closed since she was asleep, right? Paul had been in the living room watching television when it happened. He was quite the night owl, and Joanne was always an early riser, one of the many reasons it hadn't worked out between the two of them. Still, she was quite thankful, and even though he was long gone and other men had taken his place in front of the living room TV, no one else had ever heard her calls. These days, of course, she was single. Well, single and dating, but no one was living with her. Still, it didn't stop her from trying to call out in the night, as she was quite sure that if she could transform her moan into an articulate word, it would be enough to wake her up. Thus far she'd been unsuccessful, and so she was always left with the third option. This was the hardest to explain. It was basically waking herself up by using her mind. She did this by tensing up certain muscles, tightening and tightening them, coiling them like tigers preparing to pounce, and then using all her strength to spring them. But this was an inept description because it wasn't really muscles she was flexing, at least no muscles she could duplicate moving while awake. The only thing she could compare it to was another dream she'd had. This one, at least, she was really sure that it was a dream. In it, she was flying, and she accomplished this amazing feat by using muscles that did not truly exist except in her dream self. The awakening maneuver was something like that, except that whatever phantom muscles were being used, they felt like they were in her head or neck area, while the flying muscles seemed to be in her abdomen. Anyway, this move had yet to fail. It was just a matter of how long it might take. She likened it to climbing out of a deep well. The deeper her sleep prior to waking up paralyzed, the further down the well she would feel. So each spring brought Jo closer and closer to the surface and to consciousness. Between these leaps, she could only stare at the room she lay in and breathe, while praying that her breathing would not become obstructed. When she first began having sleep paralysis, it was always accompanied by severe panic attacks, which usually involved this particular fear. As if waking up paralyzed wasn't bad enough to give you a panic attack, the thought of possible suffocation could certainly throw you over the edge. Eventually, her anxiety diminished by sheer familiarity. And so, Joanne came awake with this uncomfortable but not wholly foreign sensation. Where she was didn't register as much as the driving need to regain body movement. She forced her elbow an inch off her stomach in an effort to raise her hand to her face. A good smack across the cheek would do the trick nicely. Yeah, that was never going to happen. It would be easier to levitate her entire body off the bed. With each exhale, she moaned as best she could, trying to shape a perfect scream. No dice. Finally, she applied her mental powers. Her breathing was deep and calm. Jo realized that before she woke up, she was in as deep of a sleep as she'd ever been while experiencing this paralysis. Her first coil and spring didn't even raise her toward wakefulness at all. The panic that had receded through the years shot back immediately. What if this is permanent? How long could she lay here? What if something covered her mouth? What if a bug came crawling toward her face? She stifled these thoughts and took a few breaths. Truly, what else could she do? In waking life, she'd had experience with chronic anxiety, mostly due to a short stint with some bad weed. Pot always made her paranoid, which was the main reason she stopped smoking in college. She'd learned then how to calm herself. Once composed, the terror always dissipated, and this was no different. She pressed her mind against the wall of sleep again, and this time felt it give a little. It was just a matter of waiting a moment and trying again. Waiting a moment and trying again. Eventually, it would give, and she could wake fully. The first thing she would do is turn over. There were times in the past when it happened so frequently that she got pretty good at waking herself up. She would merely shake her head, annoyed at the interruption to her sleep, and then doze back off, only for it to happen again a few moments later. It only seemed to occur when laying supine, so she quickly learned to roll over before drifting back to sleep. Joanne relaxed herself as much as she could and mentally charged again. This time she felt the normal tremble, like passing through a wave of energy. For most people, the sensation of waking happens so quickly that despite the fact a person will go through it thousands upon thousands of times in his life, he can never really know what it's like. Joanne could tell you. It was like the first breath of a baby. It was like a harmless electrical shock. Another jolt or three, and she'd be there. She rested, slackened her muscles, and pushed again. How long had she been laying here? The sleep seemed unnatural. It was almost too bad that the paralysis was so awful. If she could only enjoy the complete relaxation and lose herself within it. But no, that was not even an option. Another shake of her mind, and she was out, taking a deep breath and rolling onto her side. Thank fucking God, she thought. She was groggy. Despite rising from such a deep sleep, the thought of going right back into it sounded pretty good. Until... Where the hell am I? Jo sat up quickly in bed, and dizziness threatened to put her right back into unconsciousness. Her hands clutched the sheets at her side, white and starched. They felt expensive against her fingers, but right off the shelf, brand new, not the well-washed blue ones that had adorned her bed at home. Accompanying the wooziness was nausea. She glanced around the room quickly. Not only was it certainly not her own, it was one that she didn't remember ever having been in. The panic that she had been able to suppress so easily in her sleep boiled over. She swept the blankets off of herself and jumped out of the bed, tripping and falling to the soft pile carpet. It was tan, a fairly attractive shade, and skidding along it gave her a little burn on her thigh. Jo stared with horror at the little red mark on her leg. Something wasn't connecting. Something wasn't making sense. Or it was making even less sense than the fact that she had woken up in a strange place. The burn wasn't particularly serious. It would probably be gone in a day or two. Joanne reached out and touched it. The coolness of her fingers felt pleasant on the raw skin. She dragged her hand up her leg until it met the fabric of the garment that she wore. She grabbed it and held it away from her body so that she could get a good look. It was a nightgown, silky, sheer, actually rather lovely, but altogether not hers. Somehow she was somewhere dressed in someone else's clothes. There was a chain cord attached to the foot of the bed. Its length snaked up under the covers and then back out and down. It ended at a manacle that encircled Joe's ankle. She released the gown and grasped the chain instead. It was a fairly thick link, covered in a plastic coating so the metal would not be exposed to the elements. Joanne had a length of it in her own dining room. It held up her chandelier. That was the reason why she had fallen out of bed. Joanne sat on the plush carpet surveying the room. The panic had lifted for sheer fright. However, despite this, she felt calmer. Something in her mind told her that she was in no immediate danger. She was chained to the bed. That said that she was here for the long haul, whatever that meant. She tried sliding the cuff from her ankle, but there was very little wiggle room, and she gave up quickly. She continued taking stock of the room. There were no less than 3 doors, one in the center of each wall, except the wall the head of the bed rested against. She stood up carefully and pulled down her gown. It landed just above her knee. She was wearing no panties. This fact was as unnerving as any of her other discoveries thus far. She walked slowly to the door beyond the foot of the bed and turned the handle. Locked. Did she really expect anything else? She systematically checked the others with the same results. The chain stretched out to its maximum distance at the point just before the door at the foot of the bed. If safety was beyond this particular door, she would need to free herself of her shackles before escaping through it. The cord around her leg was attached to the back leg of the bed, and she crouched down on her hands and knees to look. It was looped around the metal frame, which was in turn bolted into the ground right through the carpet. A quick glance notified Joe that all the legs were bolted down in this manner. Looks like the bed's not going anywhere. Beside the door at the foot of the bed, a flat-screen television was mounted on the wall, and next to that was a tall bookcase in the right-hand corner. Near the door on the left side of the bed was a small table and chairs. These pieces of furniture, too, were fastened down tight. Beside the door on the right of the bed and near the bookcase was a small refrigerator. Apparently a person could live for a while quite comfortably in this room. That was when she noticed the 3 buckets along the left side wall near the door there. They were the sort that Joanne had seen when she worked one summer waitressing at a restaurant. Large, white, 5-gallon plastic pails that had held whole dill pickles, in that particular case. These 3 had something written on the lids in black magic marker. One read, urine. The second stated, feces, while the last said TP. Scratch that previous thought. Perhaps one could live a long while in this room, but it may not be as comfortably as was first surmised. Joe rubbed the back of her arm and silently approached the buckets. Gingerly, she lifted the lid to the one marked urine. It was empty. Thank God for small favors. Unfortunately, Joe wasn't sure how long she could last before filling it up after her prolonged sleep. She looked around the room, searching for peepholes in the walls and on the doors. The door at the foot of the bed had what appeared to be a small rectangular window. However, it was covered on the other side. Still, she certainly felt as if she was being watched. Gripping the brand-new roll of toilet paper that had previously been atop the middle bucket, she squatted on the open container, feeling the color rising in her cheeks. The gown dropped down far enough that no one walking in would be able to see anything lurid. Still, it took her long minutes to relax enough to relieve herself. She kept a vigilant eye on each door in turn, expecting any one of them to fly open. Eventually, she finished up and snapped the lid back on while disposing of the toilet paper in the proper receptacle. She went back to prowling the room like a caged tiger, taking a mental inventory. The bookcase held books, as well as CDs and DVDs. Beside the bed was a night table stand. The top level held a box of facial tissues, a lamp, and a digital clock. If the latter was to be believed, it was 6:30 in the evening on the 1st of January. Joanne thought a moment. She'd been abducted on New Year's Eve. More precisely, it had been New Year's Day. She'd been at Greg's party in Sherman Oaks, had stayed past midnight, and had suddenly gotten sick to her stomach. She decided to head for home. It was only about 1 a.m. She couldn't remember anything beyond that except waking up here. That meant she'd lost track of over 17 hours. Almost anything could happen in 17 hours. On the bottom shelf of the night table stand was a CD player and a DVD player stacked one on top of the other. All the comforts of home, thought Joe, and wondered who she had to thank. An idea entered her thoughts. Maybe whoever had put her here was waiting for her to wake up. Should she call out, or maybe knock on the door? If she could bring this person inside, could she overpower him? If it was a woman, perhaps she could. But why would a woman do such a thing to her? Why would anyone do this to her? What the hell was going on? And just like that, with only a few fragmented thoughts, the fear gripped her again. She was like putty in its hands. Her mind raced, and she lost control. She fell on her knees, shaking and crying, clutching the blankets at the end of the bed and moaning into them. The moan became a sob, and the sob a scream. She shouted for help at the top of her lungs. She called out repeatedly for long minutes until her throat was sore and her voice was hoarse. "Somebody help me! Help me, please!" No one came to her rescue. No one came to harm her. No one came at all.
That was chapter 1 of Midnight Surrogate. I hope you liked it. I told you it's a little challenging. It gets even worse not worse, it gets better in chapter 2. So if you liked it, like, share, and subscribe. Please subscribe to my channel. It helps my build my channel, and it helps the YouTube algorithm and all that crap.